Very few people have gotten the kind of send-off that Nikki Haley got on Tuesday. I, in fact, spoke to someone at the White House last night who was feeling pretty proud about the way things went down yesterday. What was your take?
Look, well, I mean, Haley was remarkable in that she managed to be both independent and loyal and effective, and that's a combination that you don't usually get in this administration. She's one of the few people, I would say Jim Mattis is the other clear person who will emerge from the administration in a stronger personal position than they were in when they entered it. So I think Haley has set herself up clearly as a front runner for as a Republican in 2024. But I think she's going to have roles to play in the administration, perhaps 2 or 3 years down the road if it's reelected.
All right, Betsy, we should remind people of the major foreign policy developments that did take place on Haley's watch. U.S. imposed new sanctions on North Korea. We withdrew from the Iran nuclear deal. We withdrew from the Paris Climate Agreement. We withdrew from UN Human Rights Council, halted funding for a UN program that helps Palestinian refugees move and of course, they moved the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem. What's your takeaway in terms of her legacy? Because much of what was on that list happened on her watch, but weren't her doing. Certainly not pulling out of the Paris Climate Accord.
Nikki Haley's legacy at the UN is one that has absolutely delighted the kind of Republicans who were very skeptical about the Trump administration, particularly folks from the Bush camp who wanted to see the Trump administration take more of a traditional Republican tack when it came, for instance, to questions like Russia's presence in North Korea, and additionally, of course, the relationship between the United States and Israel. One moment that was really important for Nikki Haley when it came to securing support from that particular cohort was when she very vocally defended Israel, even as it was facing scorching criticism from much of the international community over the way Israel handled Palestinian protesters. So Nikki Haley has definitely seen her stock rise significantly with that particular sector of the Republican Party. Those folks are going to be very enthusiastic about whatever her future looks like. Additionally, another important accomplishment that people in Nikki Haley's camp point out as something that's going to be part of her legacy is the fact that she was able to secure unanimous support from the UN Security Council for new sanctions targeting petroleum as it relates to North Korea. So she certainly, within a certain cohort of the Republican Party and on the right, has had a lot that heartens them, that has people betting on her going forward.
Mark, I want to play something that the president said specifically about the role of the ambassador to the United Nations.
I think it's become maybe a more glamorous position than it was 2 years ago. Maybe I wonder why, but it is. I mean, she's made it a very glamorous position. She's made it a more importantly, a more important position.
What in God's name is he talking about? And what kind of insult is that to a smart or intelligent, capable woman as Nikki Haley saying she's made the position more glamorous?
Well, it's the kind of insult you would expect from a misogynist like Donald Trump. He doesn't know what to say. I think she kind of summed it up when they had that flare up around the sanctions against Russia, and she eventually described herself as getting ahead of the curve. But the administration said she made an announcement. She was confused. She says, "I don't get confused." And clearly she doesn't. He's the one that's confused, even making statements like that.
Then quickly, Brett, then at this point, we're totally desensitized to what the president said. You've got a woman like Nikki Haley who sits there and has to smile while he says that. Dina Powell may be up for the job. She made a name for herself in the advancement of women and girls, and now she's looking at a job that the president says it's more glamorous.
Yeah, I mean, Nikki Haley didn't bring glamour to the job. She brought brains and hard work, a fantastic work ethic, and I think that's going to be her legacy.
Powell shouldn't mind the glam job.
Dina Powell is an extraordinary person. She would serve with great distinction. Should be, I think, our first Arab American ambassador to the UN. She's smart as a whip. She'd be a really good choice, and glamour has nothing to do with it.
But at this point, are we, Betsy, at this point, do we just accept that this is the way that the president speaks and, chalk it up to nothing like, oh, what if our crazy uncle said that we look like a hot little biscuit on Thanksgiving?
It certainly isn't something that
it's
surprises.
like that, though. Like, we're laughing, but that is what we're talking about.
The way that the president talks has been consistent going all the way back to his candidacy, and the president's supporters have no defense that they aren't aware that he's going to talk about powerful, influential women in the kind of terms that you would use to talk about people in less politically significant roles. The reality is that people who support the Trump administration, people in his orbit, people working for him know that this is the way that he talks about women. And the people in his orbit, look, it's baked in. It's not a surprise. He's acting within his character. We know what to expect from the president.
Brett, is this Nikki Haley's job to lose? Are there other names we haven't thought of? I believe the president has said he's happy with Dina Powell's job to lose. He's happy with Grenell in Germany.
Look, I don't know. It clearly he talked about having five names.
But we haven't heard any of them besides Dina's.
Dina would be a terrific choice for the reasons I just mentioned. Rick Grenell, also, I think, a strong choice because he's close to the president. He's been at the UN. He worked for John Bolton at the UN for many years. Other UN ambassadors. Be the first, I think, openly gay American ambassador to the United Nations. That might be significant as well. But there are a few other names that I can imagine the president choosing from.
But what difference does it make? Because he shoots from the hip anyway, even of all these people, and many of them are qualified. I mean, I would wonder if I was that qualified as maybe a Dean or a Richard, would I want that kind of job where I could be superseded and talked over?
Listen, Dina is in a unique position.
It does make a difference. People at the highest level of the United Nations bureaucracy have told me how grateful they have been to Nikki Haley for providing a bridge and for offering the kind of quiet diplomacy.
But Dina is in the unique, distinct position as someone who left the administration unscathed as opposed to everyone else. Does she want to put herself back in there?
That's a question for her.
We'll soon find out.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.